Welcome to the Art Lady home. Today I'm about to start my vegetarian beef stew, and I have all of the ingredients out on the counter, and then I have some of the pots that I'm going to be using today just so that you have an idea of what goes into this. I'm going to first start off roasting most of my vegetables in a pretty large size roasting pan, and this is one that's used for turkeys. Normally you could cook a turkey in this. So that's what I use to roast my vegetables in. And I'm going to start out by washing and cleaning and cutting most of the vegetables you see here. We have some green onions. I'm going to put in 4 regular onions. I'm going to pop in the rest of my tomatoes. I'm going to do a full garlic clove here. A package of baby Bella portobello mushrooms. I'm going to throw in probably 8 potatoes, what I have left for my potatoes. I want this to be a nice hearty stew. And then I'm going to put in those 2 packages of carrots, and that's a half a package of celery right there. And meanwhile, I'm going to be preparing my lentils, because this is going to be a beef lentil stew, and I want it to be a complete meal. I want it to have the protein in it, so that's why I'm incorporating my lentils. Now let me show you some of the spices that we'll be using, and of course I'm going to put in some red wine, and this is a red wine blend, and any very inexpensive wine will work, or hearty, heavier wines are really nice in stews as well. But I'm going to throw in a little bit of cumin into my vegetables, and I'm going to show you how I do this step by step. We'll be using some salt, smoked paprika, ground thyme, celery salt, bay leaves, and then some ground rosemary. Now, of course, if you have any of the fresh rosemary and thyme, you can throw that in as well. I just don't happen to have any ground thyme on hand. I do have a rosemary plant, but it's not looking that great. It needs to catch up and grow a little bit more before I chop it up again. Then, of course, we're going to toss the vegetables with some olive oil. But I'm going to show you step by step how I prepare this. I've just finished washing and preparing all the vegetables, but I do want to show you how I'm doing my potatoes. I just take the potato, and where I see any blemishes, I just trim off a little bit of this blemish here. I'm not peeling the entire potato because I want to keep most of the skin on for extra nutritional value. That's up to you if you want to peel yours, but this is how I do it, just quickly. And then I'm going to dice it up into fork-sized chunks. I like my vegetables pretty chunky in my beef stew. See how I'm digging out any of the eyes? So it shouldn't take you a long time. I've been timing it just to give you an idea of how long it's taking so far. And to wash and prep all my vegetables, it was 20 minutes. Now, when I do my potatoes, I just quickly slice them down, like I said, into big fork-sized chunks, probably about 1 inch thick. And then I dice them like this, just real quick. If any of them that are a little bit bigger, you can chop in half. I want these to cook up pretty good and quick in this pot, and you don't want to leave anything real big, you know, like, of course, like that, obviously. You want to cut that up. Like I said, anything into a fork or spoon size, so that you don't have to cut it as you're eating your stew. And then it'll cook a little bit faster. Pretty much inch cubes and chunks. So that's how I'm going to be doing my potatoes. But I wanted to show you that first. I've just finished chopping up the potatoes, and then I also have the garlic. And I used most of that clove, that entire bulb of garlic, except 3 of the big pieces. And I saved those aside for my lentils. I want to have them flavor my lentils. So here's my garlic. I left it pretty chunky. And I'm going to go ahead and put everything in the pot now. So I'm going to put in my garlic and my potatoes right here. I'm dicing up my onions. I don't want to spend a lot of time cutting up my vegetables. I'm just cutting them into pretty big sized chunks. And I'm using 3 full onions here. And I've saved 1 onion to chop up to cook my lentils in, to put in the pot that I'm using my lentils for. So I'm going to put in all my onions, and then I'm going to get my green onion and put it. We chopped up the entire green onion package. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out probably a handful like that and keep that for my lentils to flavor the lentil water. And in goes the green onions. You can see how we're filling up my pot quick here. So I'm going to put the remainder into the lentil broth. Next in the pot is going to be the celery, and I chopped up half of a package of celery into pretty good sized chunks. Some are a little bit smaller, just random. And then I also chopped up the celery leaves as well. And that's going in my pot. We're almost to the top of this pot here. This will reduce down, and it'll create an amazing juice, and also brown some of the vegetables as well. To my pot, I'm going to go ahead and add some lentils. I've already added, like I said, my onions and my green onion. And I always sift through my lentils to make sure there is no stones. Because I have found stones, although it hasn't been for years. But I have in the past found, I think twice in my life. So it is worth checking because you don't want to obviously crack a tooth on that. So check your lentils. I drained them, I rinsed them, drained them, and now I'm pulling off, like here's a funny one. This is not matching my other color, so I'm just going to throw that out. I also pull out any like brown, solid brown ones that look like they're discolored. So double check them, go through them, and then add them to the pot. Once it's come to a boil, and I've turned down my heat rather, to a 1. And in this pot I have 6 cups of water, and I put my garlic in as well. 1 whole onion I put in, and now I'm going to add a little bit of, just sprinkle it lightly, smoked paprika. And this is what's going to flavor the lentils, because the lentils are actually kind of a neutral flavor. Here's some ground thyme. I'm going to just sprinkle a little bit in my pot. That way we get the lentils flavored with that. The thing I'm not going to do is salt. Now I've heard and read about don't salt your lentils or beans until the end, because it prevents them from softening up. So I'm going to follow that. Now some people say, oh, that's an old wives' tale, but I'm going to follow that. I'm adding a hint of my ground rosemary, cracked black pepper. So again, this is all going to be my seasonings for my lentils, and I want them to be a kind of a beefy flavor. I'm going to add some ground cumin. Again, watch to make sure nothing you're adding has salt content at this stage, because the lentils haven't started cooking yet. Like, I'm going to hold off on my celery salt. And I'm going to put a little bit of my ground thyme in. There. Okay, so I'm going to stir that up, and I'm going to cover it. And like I said, it's on a low. I brought this down to a low temperature. I'll show you that pot. Whoops. Yeah, I brought this down to a low temperature once the water came to a boil. And I'm just going to simmer this slowly. The faster you cook the lentils, cooking fast is not good for them. It makes them hard and won't soften them up. And you want them to be soft and tender, but yet you don't want them to pop open and explode from being overcooked. So I'm going to sort the rest of my lentils and put my cover on, and I'll show you once they're done. Here are the vegetables. They've been cooking for about 35 minutes. I stirred them once in between that stage, And what I did was, before I actually put them in the oven the first time, I did sprinkle them with some cracked pepper, and I did a light sprinkling like this. And I sprinkled them with some salt. And then I used, 3 bay leaves. I used a sprinkling over the whole top of ground rosemary. You can use fresh sprigs of rosemary as well. Fresh thyme, or you can use the ground thyme, and I did a light sprinkling of that. I put some smoked paprika in here, and I used about 2 teaspoons of smoked paprika. I sprinkled some heavy celery salt heavily on the top of everything. And then I used a light sprinkling on the top. And what I mean by light sprinkling is just like that, over the top of some cumin. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a cup of red wine to this. And like I said, it's been baking for about 35 minutes with the cover on. And so let me show you what it's forming now. And I did put 1 cup of liquid in here, water, to start. But look at all the juice now that it's formed right here. So it's reducing down and forming an amazing vegetable stock right now. It tastes amazing and smells out of this world. So now I'm going to go ahead and put in a cup of this red wine. And I'm going to take and have the cover off the last 20 minutes or so. 20-25 minutes. And this is what's going to form the juice for our pot. I may just keep that bottle open right now. Okay, now I'm going to put this back in the oven. Let me toss it to coat it. And this is what's going to give it that beautiful deep, ooh, look at that color already. Wow, look at that. Oh, this smells amazing. And then my final seasonings to taste are going to be once it's mixed with the lentils. And then I add some of this. I'm going to thicken this juice up and make it a nice, thick, beautiful stew. But this is the vegetables. And you can see now it's reduced down. My vegetables have reduced down to a little bit over half right now of my pan. And before it came right to the top. So we're reducing down. And like I said, I'm going to keep the cover off now. This just smells amazing. So pop this back in the oven for another 25 minutes, and I'm going to leave the cover off this time. Right now, my vegetables are starting. That's still a little hard. You want to do it so it's soft. So when you stick a fork in, it can go through. I want to do most of my cooking here in the oven. So pop it back in. I just drained the juice out of the vegetables. After about 15 minutes after I put in the red wine, I opened up the oven and I gave the vegetables a nice stir. And then I let them cook for another 15 minutes, so about 30 minutes about, with the red wine. Now what I did was I pulled out the vegetables from the oven, and then I drained most of the juice out. You can see it's just barely at the bottom here. It's just a little bit at the bottom. And I'm going to put this back into the oven and let this roast on high. It's a 400-degree oven. And I also turned on the convection so I can brown this a little bit. The vegetables are almost done. They're pretty tender. I like mine a little bit softer than this, so I'm going to put them in for another 15-25 minutes. Until they're nice and soft. Like I said, I want most of the vegetables to be cooked before I mix them in with my lentils. But meanwhile, I'm going to be making the gravy. So what I'm going to do is, or the juice for the stew. I'm going to thicken up that juice. So I'm going to push this back into the oven. And when I drained the the juice, I ended up with 4 cups of vegetable liquid, of vegetable juice right here, and it's absolutely beautiful, and it smells like heaven. It's so delicious, and this is going to make a nice, beautiful base for our beef stew right here. And so I'm going to put this back in the oven, 400 degrees, and I did turn my convection on so it can brown a little bit better. And I want to brown up those vegetables now that they're almost done. Now what I'm going to do is thicken up the juice a little bit, so I'm going to pour into a measuring cup, probably a 1/4 cup of my juice. And then I'm going to add a heaping tablespoon at a time of some flour. And I'm just going to blend this and stir this in. And so I don't add all those lumps to my juice. I'm going to eventually cook this on the stove, but this is just a simpler way to do it. So thickening, that's so you don't, and my juice is hot from the oven, so it's blending nicely. Oh my gosh. It smells amazing. I'm going to add another, you can see it's a little lumpy. I'm going to add another tablespoon. That way I can mash it against the wall here of my measuring cup. Any of the lumps. This is just a kind of like a cheating way of making a gravy. Instead of doing a little roux on the stove top, I want to just do it quick in a container like this. And this will make a nice thick. I'm going to add a little bit more of the juice.
Oh my god, that's so unfair. That almost killed me. Dude, that's unfair. Jack was telling me all this unfair.
I don't know if you can hear my son or not, but he's playing an Xbox behind me. Okay, so there. And then I'm going to add this a little bit at a time. Let me add another tablespoon. I want to make sure we have a nice thick, beautiful gravy for the vegetables in my stew. And as this cooks, this will thicken too. Thicken up. But I'm going to have this ready to go in my pan. That way I have plenty of it. So I've used 3 tablespoons of. And if you need to thicken it, you can always do this again with some more of the juice. Add more. This is how I make my thicker stews. Just by adding flour and mashing. You want to make sure all those little balls or flour balls are gone. Right in there. Oops, I don't want to spill it everywhere. I'm in the middle of making bread too. So we can have fresh made bread with this for dinner. So I have my flour out, so I'm going to thicken my gravy. There we go. The vegetables just came out of the oven. You want to make sure you roast them until they are fork tender by placing a fork inside. They're nice and soft. Like that. And this is, oof, I don't want to get too much of that steam, but they are amazing. Okay, so those are ready to go, and you can see how they're starting to brown up nicely. You don't want them too browned, but just enough. And this kind of seals the edges so that they don't fall apart in the juice. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to go ahead and show you now the lentils, because those are pretty much done. My lentils are done. You want to cook the lentils to your preference. I prefer them to be cooked so that they're tender. So that you want, I'm getting some steam here. So that when you bite into them or eat them, they don't crunch out. So that you don't say, oh, what's that? So what I do is I cook them so that they're soft enough that I can just actually squish in my hand. Here. Oh, I'm getting a lot of steam. Whew. So taste them, and I've been tasting them for the last 25 minutes. They seem to have cooked a little bit longer. This at least was I'd say at least an hour and 20 minutes of cooking. About 30 minutes ago, I did turn up the heat a little bit because they were just taking forever on a very, very low. Like I said, I set it on a 1, then I bumped them up to a 3 the last 30 minutes, and now they are at a nice tender, perfect actually consistency, and a lot of my juices have absorbed and they've plumped up the lentils, and some of my juices are evaporating now. So you can kind of tell when all that happens, they're ready, as long as they're getting a little bit bigger and tender. But like I said, you don't want them so that they all split open. I don't want to be able to take a bite of my stew and taste crunchy lentils. That's my preference. But like I said, you can cook it any way you want, how you like your lentils. Now, to this pot, I'm going to go ahead and add my juice. Right here, the 4 cups of juice from the vegetables. And I do want, see the residue at the bottom here? I do want to get all of that in the pot as well, because that's a lot of the herbs and spices. There. And give that a little stir. And then I'm going to slowly incorporate in my flour mixture. Right here. Let me bring this back out a little bit more. And I'm going to slowly just incorporate some of the flour to thicken this. And this was the flour with the vegetable juice. Ooh, I'm getting steam. I'm going to go ahead and incorporate the rest, and then I'll show you what it looks like. I've incorporated the rest of the flour mixture, and now I'm going to turn up my heat to a medium. I did it about a 6 out of 10, and I'm going to heat this up hot, and this is going to start thickening right here. I want to do this before I add my vegetables. I want this to get nice and thick. I'm going to cook this for a few minutes, and then I'm going to, you can see it's starting to get thicker right now, and then I'm going to go ahead and add my vegetables to this. I've just incorporated everything. I've added my vegetables, stirred it around a little bit. I did put a cup of water in to just so that the liquids can cover everything. I may add another ½ cup of water just so that the liquids can come to the top here. I don't want any vegetables sticking out without juice. The potatoes are going to start absorbing more of this liquid as well, and I'm going to cook it for about 30-45 minutes just on a low heat so all of this infuses together. This is going to get thicker too, but I just had a lot of vegetables and not a lot of juice. So I am going to cook this up a little bit more. You can see here how much it's really pretty thick. I wanted this to be a thick, hearty soup, but I just didn't have enough liquid to cover everything. So I'm going to go ahead, cover this, and let it all infuse together. I'm adding a can of petite diced tomatoes right now to it. You want to add your acid and your salts after the lentils are cooked. So I made sure that they were perfect before I'm adding this. The acids and the salt slows down the cooking of the lentils, supposedly. So I'm incorporating that in. And this will be done. I'm just waiting on my bread before we actually have dinner. I cooked it on a 3 temperature with the cover on for about 15 minutes. And then what I'm doing is I just added another half a cup or so of wine, red wine, to it. And then I added some more salt and pepper to taste. And it's starting to really form a beautiful stew. And I like cooking it in the oven as opposed to just cooking it all on stovetop. It seems like it cooks a little bit faster. I don't have to cook it for 4 or 5 hours on the stove. But look at this beautiful, thick stew gravy it's made. So it's really a great flavor. I think this is as close as you're going to get to a beef stew without actually having meat in here. And it's a lovely beef stew taste, actually. So I hope you enjoy it, and we're going to serve it with some of that French bread, or homemade bread rather, and it's a garlic bread that I just made that's absolutely delicious. So we're going to serve it with that, and so I hope you enjoy it. And here is the final stew. It has a beautiful consistency. Look at that. I did add another can of diced tomatoes to the stew, and that just because it was so much volume of vegetable and so much volume of stew, it needed 2 of them, so that when you pick it up, you have, you can see the chunks of the red stew tomato. And it was actually a diced tomato, so 2 cans of diced tomatoes to that, but I forgot to mention that. And then we're serving it with this nice crusty garlic bread here, and I hope you enjoy it too. Bon appetit.